So as I talked, it'll be the hunt for usable error documentation. When you're going to a web page and you see that it's connected securely, there's a lock symbol and some sort of certificate stuff. This is the case when everything is as it should be, everything is secure and the certificate validates well. When there's a problem in the browser, you see something like this. I mean, the text may not be the best ever that you've seen as technical writers, but it's still pretty good. It tries to explain you in rather simple terms what the problem is. There's also some sort of a more advanced error code for the developer that you might be able to Google or some sort. The situation is much more problematic if you're a developer, because when you need to do a very similar thing, validate the certificate to find out whether the connection is okay, whether the certificate is valid or not, you run a terminal command to do, for example, OpenSSL verify, and you get something like this. And then you see error 34 at zero depth lookup unhandled critical extension. You may have not the slightest idea what that means, and believe me, I've asked the developers, and often the security developers often don't have no idea either. So as you would, they start Googling. So OpenSSL unhandled critical extension, and you find out, well, unhandled critical extension. This is a real screenshot from the documentation of OpenSSL. So thank you, Captain Obvious. The documentation is totally not helpful. And I mean, this is not just the case for OpenSSL. For example, in GNU-TLS, in a very similar function, you can get an error saying the certificate presented just isn't the expected one that the software expected. And then saying something about tofu, though it's probably not this kind of tofu, but you will be wondering the same as the developer. And believe me, I've asked, they have no idea either. And the thing is that there's really many of these errors. This is a list of the errors of OpenSSL just related to certificate documentation. And it goes on from the slide, though I was unwilling to have the font even smaller because this way it's at least a little bit readable. So our thinking was that we would like to write a better documentation, but how would we know what would the developers want or need in the error message? Would they want it short? Would they want it extra long? Do they want to know what to do, or what the risks are, or what the limitations are? So we decided to ask. At DevConf 2020, a small, well, international conference of developers, mostly open source, co-organized by Red Hat, about 1,600 participants altogether over 3 days. We set up a booth. We were 4 basically academia members, bachelor and master students of mine and a colleague of mine, and we let them join research by filling in a questionnaire regarding error messages. The questionnaire had 4 parts. There was a current documentation of OpenSSL, basically the non-documentation, and as I would call it, the single line that you've already seen, and questions regarding its evaluation, whether devs are satisfied with it, in what way yes, in what way no, what they would change, both asking on scales and free text answers, just write what you would like there. Then there was a redesigned documentation proposed by us, and again asking similar question on its evaluation. Then we asked some opinions on what would the ideal documentation look like, how long would it be, what parts would it have, what parts would you not use, and stuff like that. And finally, some sort of questions on demographics and previous experience that we wanted to correlate just to be sure that the case is that not the more experienced developers think different things than the less experienced developers, which doesn't seem to be the case, by the way. We had over 180 valid participants doing the whole questionnaire and some more doing only parts of it. And these were participants of the conference, so it means developers, administrators, the people actually using the stuff. The original documentation, as I mentioned, is just a single line. The thing is that the line often replicates what is in the textual error code. The redesigned documentation that we suggested looks something like this. There's the error code, we kept it the same. There's a single line summary that we would also like to be displayed in the command line verification, ideally, still better than error 34 at 0 depth lookup. And then there are 4 paragraphs going through the explanation of what happened, the security perspective, what this means for the security of the process, what should you do, and what are the consequences, mostly the consequences if you ignore the error. And as technical writers, you probably know that this documentation is far better than this, at least because there is actually something in it. So we kind of expected that people will like this one much more, but we were interested in the details. Whether, for example, this is not too long for a documentation for a single error for them. Whether they would omit or drop any of the parts, the 4 paragraphs that we created. Would they want it shorter, longer? And this is a documentation that was created by me and a couple of colleagues of mine. So reading it, you as technical writers, I guess, probably already see small or bigger things where it could be improved. For example, the formulations are probably not the clearest, and I'm not native English speaker, so there are definitely things to improve. Since we are still analyzing the results and we are in the process of writing a publication, this will be more of a sneak peek of the results, but feel free to ask. I may know more details of the answers than those presented. In general, people, as I mentioned, we expected, wanted our redesigned documentation more than the original. Though of the 180 participants, about 20 of them actually preferred the original documentation. This was mostly because ours seemed to them a little bit bloated or too long for what they wanted, but there are other reasons. I'll come to that in a later slide. For the colorful coding, this mentions 3 different certificate errors that can happen. Expired certificate, a certificate with a mismatch in the name, and the certificate with the unhandled critical extension, which is the documentation that I've shown you on the previous slide. We did this to see and to prevent the results to be biased by just a single error. For example, expired is rather known, so we would expect that people may want short documentation because it's simple. But the unhandled critical extension is something that's quite complicated and quite rare. So the devs don't understand it right away usually. But as you see from the graph, it seems that roughly the same ratio of people in all 3 types of the documentation preferred ours to the original. So in this respect, and this was replicated in other results as well, the 3 errors behaved rather similarly. So we dare say that the results generalize quite a bit over many, if not all, of the errors. As for the second sneak peek, we asked them for both documentation, the original and the redesigned, on a selected list of possible issues, whether they are present or not. From the answers were on a scale from no, rather no, yes, and rather yes. These are just the participants saying yes or rather yes to the issues being present. So we can see that, I'm not sure, do you see the cursor of mine when I pointed something? Yes, okay, thanks, Lena. So the original documentation was found to be incomplete and ambiguous by quite some people, which is of no surprise, really. For the inconsistency, there was some inconsistency seen in the original documentation, no incorrectness in ours or in the original or redesigned. And as I mentioned, our documentation seemed a bit more bloated and tangled than the original documentation. It may seem weird to you that there were 14 people that found the original single line documentation bloated. Looking into the free text answers, for example, many of them mention that it's bloated because the text line of the documentation just replicates what's said in the error code. As you've seen, as you see in here, unhandled critical extension is basically set twice. And a lot of the devs didn't like this. And that's why they said that even this documentation seemed a bit bloated to them because just the error code is sufficient. saying some qualitative statements of the devs on our documentation. There were people who liked that the first information is a very concise single line the explanation that gets you on the track if you know your way around. On the other hand, there were people who found the first line basically redundant because then the same is reiterated in more detail. Though I would say that if I remember correctly, many more people liked the concise summary at the beginning than those disliking it. People were a bit inconsistent in what paragraphs they would want. There were people explicitly saying that they totally don't require and are not interested in the security perspective. And on the other hand, there were people saying that security perspective is the most important part of the whole documentation. This was partially explained by the people sitting at different roles, because there were admins, there were developers, there were QEs, and there were even managers. For managers, consequences and security perspectives were much more important than what to do and explanations, because they would not be the people doing the what to do stuff and needing to explain the situation to other developers. So overall, none of the parts was hated or loved too much. I'll come to the detailed results on the next slide. So summarizing the issues, the arrows here means whether the change is significant in increase or decrease. Our documentation was significantly less incomplete and ambiguous, or at least seen as significantly less, and significantly less inconsistent, though significantly more bloated and tangled.
Excuse me, Martin.
Yeah,
I'm a little bit unclear what you mean by tangled.
Tangled, well, the list of issues is taken from a research paper of possible issues inspected, asking free text answers of the developers. Tangled is basically that the structure is confusing and you are unable to find what you're looking for. That's sort of tangled.
Yeah, that's perfectly clear. Thank you.
You're welcome. So what I wanted to say that when we look into absolute numbers, although our documentation is seen more bloated and tangled by a couple of more people, the decrease in incompleteness and ambiguity is much, much larger. So I would still say that our documentation is seen as better than the previous one, which is also supported by the single, very simple question, which documentation would you prefer? Another sort of results. We asked the people after seeing each documentation whether they understand the error, whether they are satisfied with the documentation, and whether they find the documentation helpful. It's nice that satisfied and helpful had basically the same answers. They correlate very much. And as you can see, they were much more satisfied with our documentation and they found it helpful. As for the understanding, we were quite surprised that there was a non-trivial amount of people who seemed to either understand or kind of understand the documentation in the first place, though this is a point where the individual errors differ quite a bit, because the expired case, as I mentioned, is rather simple, and there the green part was even longer. For the unhandled critical extension, more than half of the people said either rather no or no. Though after the change, the understanding section is rather consistent, and there always more than 3/4 of the people said yes. So at least self-reported understanding seems much better. As for the parts, as I mentioned, these were the parts that we had. It was the error code, the single line description, then explanation, security perspective, what to do, and consequences. We asked the participants how important they saw these parts to be. The error code was by far the most important. The qualitative answers often said that it's important because they want to copy paste that into Google or elsewhere if they are going to look for more details. So the error code works kind of as a unique identifier of the particular error and is a little bit more usable than the number error 34. Short description, that is the summary sentence that I mentioned, liked by quite some many people. And then for the 4 paragraphs, it's more or less equal, though consequences were less seen as important. When we explicitly asked whether they would drop a paragraph of the whole documentation of our design, you can see the percentages on the right. 2/3 of all the participants said that they would keep all 4 paragraphs and the short description and the error code in there. We also asked about what length they would want the documentation, about the number of lines, and they wanted about 2 to 4 lines in average shorter than the one that we proposed. But in general, they were satisfied. I was quite surprised myself that the documentation, although being quite long, was still much appreciated by all the devs, QEs, managers, and all the participants there. There's another part, some kind of an application part of the research of ours. Now, kind of knowing what works and what doesn't in the developer's mind, we decided to fix it, or at least a little bit of it. So we're trying to consolidate documentation of different libraries and create our documentation ourselves. We made a web for that that is trying to make X509 errors usable. It lists the errors, currently mostly the OpenSSL errors, but we are adding other commonly used.
Jo, počkej, je to zpátky, tak nevím, jak to proběhlo.
Is there a question or not? Someone's mic is on.
I think Vendula forgot her mic on.
Okay. So we have a website with listing the errors, and for each of the errors, we're trying to get the devs an example certificate that generates the error. So if they want it for testing or something of the sort, and to give them documentation of different libraries, because the different libraries, although in theory having the same problems possible, the error messages are different, the error names are different, and even the scopes are different, because embed TLS just says name violation, and OpenSSL has 4 different detailed errors just subsumed by the name violation in embed. So underneath the website, there is a table trying to map the errors in between the libraries, because in the, although idealistic and maybe not reachable future, all the libraries would have same errors, same documentation that would be nicely written. And you would not need to write the documentation all over again. So that's an interesting point in writing documentation. If we unify the tools and unify the interfaces, we can get less work for the technical writers. Summarizing, we are doing experiments with IT professionals at DevConf. We've already done it for the 3rd time, usually having them perform a task and then asking for their real opinions. And we've summarized most of this year's and last year's research into a website that's trying to achieve a better documentation. As for the experience exchange, as this is a workshop aiming for experience exchange, you may be interested in reading some research of ours. If you're interested in the particular one that I was presenting here, probably email me, because the paper is not finished yet, and I may email you the paper once it's written. Or there may be papers from the past that you might be interested in. In that case, probably emailing me or chatting with me might work better, because I would just give you the one that fits your ideas best. If you're not used to reading academic papers and diploma theses and stuff like that, they might be a little bit overly long to your liking. What experience exchange would help me, on the other hand, is since we are drafting new documentation and we are not tech writers, we may be missing basic things. So even if you would be able to help me with formulations and clearer English, I would appreciate that. We have 6 new cases written with nice documentation of the 5 sections that I've shown you, and we want to present it on the website that I've shown you. And if any of you found like probably an hour or so of your time and would be willing to help to just read the documentation after us and improve the language, I would very much appreciate that. Which concludes the talk. And as I mentioned, if you're interested in the project itself, feel free to click the website or write me and we can discuss other details.